Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankar Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. I'm super excited to invite Vivienne Ming to the podcast. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've been running around the UK and the East Coast, and so being able to just sit in my studio and chat with you is going to be a real pleasure.
We're excited to have you. So right off the bat, you're the founder and executive chair at Zoic Labs, but you describe yourself as a professional mad scientist, which I think is one of the most fun titles I've ever seen. What makes a professional mad scientist?
Well, first, it does a lot of work for me by just scaring away the squares on LinkedIn. A recruiter just reached out to me about a global CTO position. I'm like, did you really think that this person should be in charge of the global decisions of a multi-billion-dollar organization? But having said that, really, it was that I started my career as a neuroscientist, a theoretical neuroscientist at UC Berkeley. And then my wife and I had the terrible idea of starting an educational technology company together using AI. So it was before Coursera and Khan Academy. Let me be clear, Silicon Valley was not particularly interested in funding a couple of kooky women with education aspirations, but I got a little hooked, and I've started many, many companies over the years. But what I learned what I loved about academic science and startup science, if you will, is I got to learn something new, turn it into something that helped a real person in the world, and everything else, grant writing and fundraising and monthly KPIs, I can pretend to be a grown-up, but they just never moved me. Fortunately, I've hired lots of grown-ups over the years to make certain that stuff gets taken care of. But what I realized is I needed to start a philanthropic lab. So the reason I call myself a professional mad scientist is people reach out to me. Dr. Ming, my daughter has 500 seizures a day. Please save her life. Our company has bias in its promotion process. Help us build an economic model to actually price that bias against a counterfactual world in which all the right people were promoted. Or, Dr. Ming, we do everything the World Bank tells us to do, but the citizens of our country still don't get hired. What's going on? And if I think my team has a truly unique perspective, then I pay for everything, and whatever we invent, we give away. And surely, if you knew what the solutions were already, it wouldn't be science.
Right.
And if anyone else was doing it, it wouldn't be mad. So I thought professional mad scientist sounds like a great self-appointed title.
I love it because I think you get to work on things you're most passionate by, right? And I think a lot of people, they end up choosing a role, or they do a startup, or build a company, and then they're married to just that one thing for a long time. And sometimes they do achieve, of course, great commercial success, but the passion, the thirst, that aspect dies down. And you seem to lean very much into that, which is if it's a problem that you really identify with, you're passionate about it, and it's something that you and your team could solve, you lean in there. So could you talk a little bit about how you choose which clients you end up working with? Because I imagine, given your profile, you have a lot of inbound interest, right? Maybe more work than you and your team can even do at this point.
Well, I mean, we should be clear. I genuinely pay for it all. So we don't do any fundraising or grant writing, and it provides incredible clarity. Do I care about this so much that I'd rather spend this money on this problem than on my kids? And that clarity is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And it does allow me to really quickly identify things I'm not interested. Some of them I'm just, I'm not very motivated about whether an idea will make a whole bunch of money. If I wanted to be richer than I already am, I probably would keep my money instead of giving it all away. So that right there has that problem solved. But more to the point of the differences between problems, I'm interested in people. Does this problem have to do with people? So some of them are obvious, like health, education, workforce. These are problems that immediately resonate with me. Some are a little bit more diffuse, such as really understanding political polarization or disinformation online, which have been philanthropic projects that I have worked on over the years. I can geek out with the best of them about self-driving cars, but when a large company reached out and asked if I'd be interested in being their CEO, I want to build better people, not better cars. Netflix reached out to me long ago about being a director of algorithms, and I love movies, particularly science fiction, big shocker. But making recommendations about what the next movie is someone watches, just that doesn't fulfill my drive about what I want to accomplish in the world. Not because it's a bad thing, but just because it's not me. Now, the flip side of that, if it's about people, how do I say no? I don't. This is the thing. I let them percolate. I give everything what I sometimes, my old Japanese office mate used to call a Japanese yes, which is to say it's not really a commitment. It's just let's let this relationship build for a little while. I'm not saying no. I'm not saying yes. Let it percolate. Because the truth is, especially with the kind of work that I do, you're waiting for moments of serendipity.
Right.
Maybe there's a new breakthrough in algorithmic research. Maybe a new data set just became available. Maybe a project really needed some large organization that had the pull to make it happen. And a perfect example of that, I was asked to join the board of a small startup that was working in affective computing. So this is AI around emotion. And I said, I'll tell you what, I will join your board, but inspired by a conversation I'd had literally the previous evening. You don't need to give me any equity in the company or any shares or anything. We're going to do a project to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. And so they agreed. But what truly made it work was later after that meeting, an employee at the time in trust came up to me and said, I heard what you were saying to the board. I actually have bipolar disorder. You can use my data. And so we used the company's technology, the research that I had read all night long because of the conversation I'd had the preceding night. Yeah. And this one single person's data, that was the synergistic moment that made something truly amazing happen. And it turns out it was actually fairly easy to predict his manic episodes, just using data that was coming off of his phone. Yep. And at the time, no one had ever done it before. So it's moments like that of being very clear what you say no to. Right. And then letting the rest of it find its own moment. Sometimes it immediately comes to fruition. Sometimes it'll take more than a decade or decades for something to suddenly click, and then that moment to actually move on it happens. But I know in startup world, there's this idea of you got to learn when to say no, and you got to say no to 99% of everything. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just putting out there there is a real value. We're all different. And finding the way that you say yes and no to things that resonates with you,
Right.
I think is better than just using someone else's rule of how to make a decision.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's spot on, which is finding that inner purpose and passion is not such a binary decision. It's not a yes or no right off the bat. Sometimes you do need to let that sink in for some time, let it percolate, as you said, because then at that point you're able to make a much more informed decision, right? Like, and that's why the common phrase "sleep on it" is such a big thing. But it's not just a night or two. Sometimes you might need weeks, months, as you're saying, years. And it's so. I think that's right. I think you don't have to say yes, but don't also immediately reject it. Sometimes when you do that, you close yourself off to opportunities that may be really beneficial. And I love your background because you've had the privilege to advise and work with some of the biggest companies in the world on AI and neuroscience and education reform and more. You've also worked with Accenture, for example. You've had requests to work with the likes of Netflix. Now, how do you envision the future of AI and human collaboration in shaping the landscape, especially for Fortune 500 companies going forward?
You know, I'm not a futurist, so it's never been my job to make the guess out of what the future is. Although there are plenty of futures that are obviously absurd. Less a matter of corporate policy than public policy. I'm sure anyone passionate about this area has been familiar with all the future of work policy papers.
Mm-hmm.
World Economic Forum. Accenture had one, the White House, the UN, everyone had one, and everyone's policy statement was things are going to change and we should teach every kid how to program. And at the time, I was saying what I think is clear to all of us now in a world with GPT-4 and Bard and now Gemini and others is writing boilerplate code is not going to get you a job. When I originally said it 10 years from now it is 10 years in the future. And sure enough, maybe if you're a designer, this seems great. I tell GPT or Bard what I want and it writes the code for me. I actually had a problem, a very esoteric one. What is the confidence interval of the product of two regression model parameters?
Mm-hmm.
And GPT gave me the wrong answer. It gave me the answer to the product of two random variables, which anyone who is just tuning in, that doesn't happen in a podcast. Let's pretend we live in a world where people tune into podcasts and you're wondering, why are we talking about statistics? What was fascinating about its response was that it was wrong, but I knew it was wrong. Mm-hmm. So I said, no, you're giving me the answer to the wrong question. Here is the question you've answered. So let's break this down. And I walked it through the problem. In the end, we had the equation I needed and the Python code to execute it on my data. I could not have done that by myself. I had an intuition of what it should look like.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the knowledge of literally what that, and it's not something that's easily looked up because it's a really esoteric kind of question. But equally, because if it gave me the wrong answer, GPT and Bard weren't able to answer that question by themselves either. So when I think of the future of work in an AI-rich world, for me, it is augmented intelligence. And it is the best of what these two forms of intelligence can do brought together. And that is not the instinct that I have seen brought to bear on any current published research. It's almost all about automation and productivity efficiency gains.
Yeah.
And that's a real choice. In the language of economics, it's about substitution. And humans are expensive. Call center workers, programmers, radiologists. If you're the CFO of any organization employing a lot of those people, you might be thinking, I only get 80% of the value out of GPT or Claude, but I get it at 100th the cost. Why are we keeping these people on staff? And to be clear, I actually don't see jobs disappearing. The demand curve, researched by David Autor and Darren Acemoglu and many others, shows pretty clearly demand at the extremes, the very low skill end and the very high skill end, through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Job demand is increasing. There will be jobs for people, but we see two separate pressures. Deprofessionalization, pushing all of this, what I call routine labor.
Yeah.
Anyone else with the same amount of education could do exactly what you're doing. There's no unique contribution from you. Then massive deprofessionalization, and now you're competing with someone that has less education than you, will take less money, and your job is slowly going to get driven in that direction.
Yeah.
At the same time, massive increase in demand for what I call creative labor.
Mm-hmm.
Labor that is not currently in the capabilities of even GPT-4 or maybe Gemini. Labor that is beyond what's possible. Essentially, I call it creative labor because it's exploring the unknown. Right. And AI, as currently formulated, is fundamentally about training models on historical data. And therefore, these models, we can get lucky and they could generalize into the future pretty well. But if you're looking at any domain where things change quickly, then you see pretty quickly the models fall apart. The fact that they're biased is just a reality of AI. I think we need to figure out how to find value in models that are biased, because they always will be, and be able to move beyond the delusion that we will ever have perfect models. But if instead we can think of models as efficiency contributors driving deprofessionalization, we turn it into what I did with that equation. How do we take amazing people, and maybe amazing people that don't have university degrees, amazing people that aren't working in consulting or medicine or whatever the hell it is I do, and even rethink, well, what is custodial work in a creative labor world? How might people actually collaborate with AIs in a way in which being a human is a unique value add? And, my kind of punchline to it is GPT knows everything, but it understands nothing. That's our job. We are the ones providing meaning and context. It has no agency. Yeah. Hopefully I'm not insulting anyone saying it's not a reasoning engine. It is the world's most sophisticated autocomplete. And what is truly astonishing about it is that makes it an enormously powerful tool. It is truly astonishing in what it can do. And I'm impressed by Bard and Claude as well. All of these big foundation models do some amazing things. Every research paper has shown that they lift productivity, largely for lower skill early career workers, overwhelmingly, in fact, for them. But I think, I'll finish my rant with this recent paper done out of MIT in collaboration with BCG, which found that even in highly skilled workers, BCG consultants, in this case, GPT and the full suite of generative models, dramatically lifted productivity on hard tasks, analyzing spreadsheets, writing a report, preparing a presentation. But I'm going to contend all of those were routine skills. And as soon as they were asked to take the next step, now what should you provide as evidence? What is your diagnosis and prognosis for your hypothetical client? Yeah. What should they do about this analysis? The people using AI actually ended up performing worse than the people that weren't. And we need to look at a world where you're, forgive me for being self-congratulatory, you're like me. You push back. You say, no, Claude, you got it wrong. GPT, I need it to be more like this. And you are a dynamic part of this. And that paper even used what works well for me as a provocative term. They said there are the centaurs that just split tasks up into, this is what AI should do and this is what I'm going to do, and just played it as a straight productivity game. But then when there were the cyborgs, they were constantly in interface with the AI tools and would say no and would push back. And we need a future full of people doing creative labor, fully living out my dream of a cyborg world. We need to be the Borg, but in a good way.
I love a lot of the things that you mentioned because there's so many things to unpack here. First, you mentioned that AI is it can augment human intelligence, right? In a lot of cases, so it's not a substitute as many make it out to be. It's augmenting, and I think you don't want to lose sight of that. I think there is opportunity to be a substitute in certain types of work, particularly the routine work that exists that humans do that they no longer need to be doing, right? But this has been an age-old thing. Like the advent of calculators made it possible for people not to go and do long-form calculations on paper. They could just use a calculator. It didn't mean that the person was out of a job. It meant that they could move faster, and it ultimately made them happier. And,
Well, if
sorry,
you
go
don't
ahead,
mind my
Vivi.
cutting in,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know when the last time I actually derived an equation was.
Mm-hmm.
There are some truly amazing mathematicians I have worked with over the years that do things in their head, but for the most part, most of us applied mathematicians, if you
Right.
will, we use Mathematica or Maple
Mm-hmm.
and we let it do it because it's so much. I will never remember to carry the minus sign.
Yeah.
So why leave it to me to make a mistake? My job is to think, what should this equation look like? Where are approximations I
Mm-hmm.
might bring in? So in its current form, this is simply not an analytically solvable, and there's no way to build an equation or an iterative
Right.
equation around this. But boy, if I did a second order approximation and I replace these terms, then suddenly I've got something I can build a machine learning algorithm around. That's my creativity. That's my art. And I'm sure many people that don't work in computational spaces don't think of mathematics as artistic and creative.
Right.
But that, I think, is one of the great examples where absolutely there's an automated part of this that machines are simply better at than human beings. But their lack of, in essence, agency or
Mm-hmm.
perspective, which is changing. I'm sure there's actually, we're pushing the collaboration point from Mathematica to Bard. We're pushing it much more, and I'm gaining some actual creative value. What are different ways I could structure this equation?
Yeah.
What are some approximations I'm not thinking of? What if someone didn't believe in the structure that I was building out here? What might they point out to be a good alternative? And that same strategy you see really good augmented writers using. Instead of saying, GPT, write this essay for me, they write the essay, or at
Right.
least the basic structure of it, and
Mm-hmm.
then they say, GPT, imagine you're someone who would completely disagree with me. Where would you find issue with this
Mm-hmm.
article? Imagine you were a reader. What parts didn't you understand? And are there some examples that might make it resonate? Now, ironically, you're not using AI to make things easier and more efficient. You're actually using it to create new frictions,
Right.
but those frictions produce better work. And that's where I truly dream. So when I say I'm not a futurist, what I'm saying is we've got these choices and they are equally valid in some basic sense. We could make the choice for substitution, we could
Mm-hmm.
make the choice for complementarity and augmentation, but I mean, the tendency right now is clearly towards substitution and efficiencies,
Right.
um, even though all the public talk is about augmentation. But this is still a choice.
Yes.
You can probably see which choice I personally would make if I could wave the wand. It has so much more value add. And I think I'm going to be a little bit pompous here. I think there's greater social stability in a world where we're trying to build better people than in a world in which we're just driving massive efficiency gains in productivity and creating a lot of instability. We made a promise to people. If you got a university degree, you'd have a job. And frankly, we just can't keep that promise anymore. And we need to think of new promises that can be made for the future. So even if that's a little bigger than the responsibility of any given company thinking about
Sure.
their internal policy, it's one that I have to take seriously in my work.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think to drive home this point, a lot of times and just a little bit of backdrop. So my company, Multimodal, we focus on workplace automation, right? So automating the very repetitive, more routine work that happens,
Absolutely.
particularly in banking and insurance, where you do things like underwriting. You have a lot of documents you're ingesting. You're punching in numbers from those documents to verify income and identity. Ultimately, make a decision, figure out what interest rate an individual should have, or a premium an individual should have, and then you're assigning it. A lot of that work can be automated. And I'm not saying all of it, but a portion of it could be automated where the person doesn't need to punch in numbers into a form. It's being extracted and you get basically down to the 1 yard line. And then the individual, the loan officer, would oversee to make sure that the decision was the right decision. And there might be things that the model, like the AI agent, can't derive from the documents provided that might help inform the decision. And that's where the human is able to apply agency and think through what context is the model potentially missing that could potentially inform the decision. So there is opportunity for the person, the human, to go and modify a decision that maybe an AI agent had made, but it changes the shape of their role a little bit.
I mean, let me second that. If for no other reason than just the realities of the economics of it, having highly paid lawyers doing basic case review and searching contracts for standard errors, having doctors just running through highly routine tests and cases and reviews, programmers, we could go on and on through a list of professionals and non-professional labor. I grew up in the Salinas Valley where John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath and In Dubious Battle, and armies of people shouldn't be bent over in fields picking strawberries and lettuce. Mm-hmm. But there is a complement to that, which is now we've freed up this labor.
Yeah.
And the promise that is often made is much like the Industrial Revolution. We're going to bring everyone forward into this new labor force. And I think we should be much more intentional about that. As technology such as yours allows companies to do that, the instinct sometimes is to shed the dead weight. And again, I'm saying that's a valid choice. I know a lot of banks looking at this from a call center perspective, and they've got big Chinese tech companies breathing down their neck in Southeast Asia and in Africa. Mm-hmm. The large banks there are looking at these tech companies really competing hard with them, and they need to shed some of their overhead in terms of human capital. But it's also their unique value add. Yeah. They have people that grew up in that market. They know their customers. Right now, those people are doing what an AI can do, which is routine labor. Yeah. They're just rubber stamping. They're pulling a lever, like in an old factory, even if it's sort of a cognitive and social lever. Now we could free them to do something better. And I genuinely call on your customers to think, we have this amazing new technology that can greatly improve the efficiencies of what we're doing. Where we can, I think I wrote about this once long ago at my one of my company's Guild. We had a data set of 122 million people. We could figure out who Google and Citibank should hire before they've ever applied. And I will say our goal was to find our specific business was to find all the people you would have ignored that didn't go to MIT and didn't have the right name and all that sort of thing. But that was an evidence of how this transforms. Instead of waiting for someone to apply and using AI to evaluate them, now we've driven the cost so low, you can essentially do a job interview on the entire planet and figure out who would be the best, and I mean this in the most righteous sense, the best fit for your company, since we all know what sometimes best fit can mean in employment. And the same thing with loans. Why wait for people to apply for a loan if you could completely flip your market and say, for every adult on this planet, what's the right loan for them? And can we tailor it and build a new market out of addressing this person? And that's amazing. Where is that human creative value add now being released into your company. And I think my advice isn't automate away all of the stuff that genuinely shouldn't be tying human beings and their creativity down, is to take a lot of that gain and reinvest it in your workforce.
That's right.
Don't just say that all of those weavers will find new jobs in the textile industry, because they didn't. Little kids did, because
Right.
their fingers fit better into the weaving machines. And it took a couple hundred years for that market to work out.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, to think right now, rather than all the instability, economic and otherwise in between, how do we find this new captured value that organizations like yours are delivering and create something transformative? Because my argument is the companies that figure that out will begin racing further and further ahead. They'll have all of the benefits of AI, but they'll have the benefits of augmented intelligence, not just the automation. And they'll begin to leave other groups behind because, frankly, if nothing else, if all you're doing is automating, what differentiates you?
Right, exactly. That's right. I think that's spot on. What our customers, ones we talk to, they know they have really great people, and their people are being tied up in doing things that, frankly, they no longer need to be doing given where the technology is. So it's really liberating them from the more routine work, so they could do more valuable work. And just to give you an example, with the loan origination, a lot of individuals can get quotes instantly given where AI is, in the sense that they get a preliminary sense of what would they be eligible for without having to wait a week or two. So you're delivering better experiences for the users that apply, and for the loan officers, they're able to spend more time on the more complex cases, or they're able to spend more time delivering better customer experiences. And the surprising thing that we found is that these people that were working as loan officers, they were embracing the change that the technology has brought about, right? It's because they don't want to do data entry. I mean, they are very qualified individuals, high intelligence, and they rather deliver better outcomes to the end users and to the company at large, which frankly means they actually command a higher compensation, because now they're doing higher value work, they're more productive, and they're able to deliver more to the bottom line for the company at large. So it ends up being a win-win scenario. I don't think all companies view it that way, to your point, right? Because I think they view it as either or, when in fact it could be both. It could be automate, and then it frees up people to do more creative endeavors, which is the differentiator, right? So you are different than your peers who are also going to be automating in due time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to steal the language of the MIT authors, you want a company of cyborgs. You don't need that many centaurs, because they're just not as big of a value add. And so people really leveraging the AI to do more than could have been happened. More than the AI or they themselves could do alone. That is value creation in the future of work.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think the other question that really keeps me up at night is, as AI is used more in sensitive industries, particularly healthcare and finance and insurance, like the ones that we typically operate in, um, it may mean that some of the decisions that affect individuals, businesses, are being driven, at least partly, maybe wholly, by some version of AI. And obviously, we know that AI is biased. I mean, all models are biased in some degree, just like people are. How do we provide regulators and the executives of these companies the ability to trace how a decision was made, where they, people feel comfortable with that, the decision that's getting made, that's an AI behind it, as opposed to a person behind it.
It's interesting, since I came to machine learning, artificial intelligence, from the idea of using as a tool in neuroscience. So, in that sense, understanding how people make decisions is very similar to trying to understand how these machines make decisions, except with the machines, you can see all of the neurons. And in humans, well, it turns out they don't allow me to stick wires into human beings at this point. there's a small population of people with epilepsy that volunteer as they're going in for surgery, and they are amazing. And so much of what we understand about truly uniquely about human brains comes from those sorts of amazing volunteers. But it is such a hard game, and we've had to work incredibly hard to gain insights. So here's a couple of truths. One is a foundational one. In machine learning, there is a famous quality called the bias variance trade-off. Mm-hmm. That the better that an algorithm is at making specific predictions on an originating data set, the worse it will do in generalizing to new domains and vice versa. Right. And so on some level, this is almost a mathematical statement that in any complex cognitive system, human beings, modern artificial AI, rats for that matter, bias is inevitable. Mm-hmm. So when I see big scientific studies saying, oh my good, GPT has a bias against Black people, my only feeling is, what the hell did you think it was trained on? You know, it turns out if you train something on the American literary history, it's got some racism and sexism in it. I don't know where you've been up until this moment, but of course it does.
Right.
So, and that unfortunately continues to be the data generated in the real world. Mm-hmm. So for me, a very classic example here of something I was almost involved in was an AI for hiring that Amazon toyed with years and years ago, and it hit the press, and so I'm not disclosing anything that we don't all know. They trained it up on all this hiring history from Amazon, and their algorithm would not hire women. And if you think about the hiring history of Amazon, is that really surprising? Whether you think that's right or not, nonetheless, the hiring history of Amazon is overwhelmingly male biased, particularly this sort of specific question, will you get a promotion in your first year at Amazon? So they did truly what they were supposed to, according to the sort of standard ethical AI approaches of that moment, and which still persist today. They removed all the gender markers from the resumes that were being trained on, all the women's colleges, all the first names, everything, retrained the whole model. And it did something amazing, something no human could do. It figured out who was a woman and wouldn't hire them. Because that was simply the biggest correlation in the data. And the thing you have to remember about even the most cutting edge of models is they are still almost exclusively correlative. Mm-hmm. They don't have a causal model of the world. Yeah. They don't know that this quality causally makes a great employee. They don't know that this quality causally creates an amazing loan customer that will pay back but still generate enough revenue for the bank to be valuable. Uh-huh. What we're looking at are correlations. It doesn't have to be that way, but it turns out causal models are so much harder to build. Right. And no one's really figured out how to make them as big as modern AI wants this stuff to be. So we work with these correlations, and they can do so much. It is starting. Our brain, as we call it, model-free learning in the human brain and beyond, and it drives so much of our behavior as well. But it is biased. And in that case of the Amazon hiring system, it really revealed on some level that bias is irreducible. And what we need to do is say this person gets a job causally because we have reason to believe they will be a great employee. And, I'm going to make the argument that we should aspire to the same thing in loan generation. Yeah. We should look at the same thing in who gets additional attention from the police, because AI is a big market for public safety and the army and beyond. And so there are people, including my own lab, doing research in causal AI or causal inference, and incorporating deep learning with this area of understanding causes. But the other thing we can do, and there's a few of them, one is having transparency in the system, sometimes called explainability. Yeah. So if you can get the AI to explain how it makes the decisions, and that is a powerful technique. But I also have a cautionary note, because one of the very company I mentioned before, the one doing AI and hiring, way back in 2014, we built a model that said, you should hire this person, and here is why. Here are the factors that principally drove this decision. And those factors were unique to the company that we were showing this resume to.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we discovered the vast majority of recruiters completely ignored all of that. And so you have to, when you build AI systems, I think you do have to understand whether we're talking about ethical AI and bias or just a good product. You have to understand it's how your users actually use the tool that matters, not how you dreamed that they would use it or what an ideal user would do given the same information. We build a tool to address bias.
Yeah.
And 2/3 of all users, almost all of the recruiters at big employers. It was actually the professional recruiters at boutique recruiting firms that really were, if I may use the term again, the cyborgs. They would dive deep. They would work with our models. They'd look for additional information. The big recruiters, they had 30 hiring managers breathing down their neck. They needed to deliver candidates. As soon as they saw a recommendation, they didn't look at anything else. They went with it. And, you have to be, I think if you want to build ethical AI, and I don't mean ethical like this is philanthropic. I mean the kind of ethics that should be in every product that is fundamental to building good product that changes your customers' lives. You need to actually do the hard work, maybe even hiring some cultural anthropologists to go make certain you've delivered a product that they're using in the way you imagined. And if they're not, you have to change, not them.
Right.
And you got to adjust your models, adjust the way you're presenting it. So, for example, one thing we did was we stopped trying to fight with the recruiters over whether we would reveal information like showing people's names. Some of our big customers asked us to take the names off, again, for some obvious bias reasons. And if we did that, the recruiters just wouldn't use our tool. So, all right, well, we leaned into it. We created a score called Demand. And it essentially was an AI-driven score of classic recruiting features. Your name, your last job, the school you went to. Those are the 3 biggest classic recruiting elements. And it was a strong predictor of whether someone would get passed through for an interview. But right next to that, we put expertise, our estimate of how good this person actually was at the job. And we made it super easy for people to see individuals that were in low demand but had high expertise. And it addressed the behavior that we were trying to generate, which is there are these amazing people that didn't go to Stanford. There are these astonishing people that haven't spent the last 15 years of their lives working for Google. And here they are. And I'm going to be super blunt. You can get them on the cheap because frankly, no one else is competing for their talents right now, but they should be. And you're going to be right there. And it wasn't like we got everyone to change, but it definitely caused a shift. And we saw an increased number of our customers leveraging these additional features, which were meant to make our system address bias in a stronger way. So it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. There is a human component to this, which you can't just wave an algorithmic wand and make disappear. And part of your job in creating a truly great product is owning the entire problem, not just building an algorithm and saying, I'm done, I'm brilliant, use it the way I told you and everything will be great. It is saying, did this system I build truly change the problem as it exists in the real world? And if not, be responsive and adapt.
I mean, these are incredible stories, and in some ways surprising that even if you remove certain things that you think would lead to bias, the model's able to correlate to them, right? And I think at the very end, what you mentioned, which is there's great talent that there's low demand for, that more and more companies, especially startups, right? And I run a startup here in New York City. There are many startups that are looking for great talent. on one hand, it's easy to hire the ex-Googlers because you know that they went through a very stringent process and they've cut their teeth on some really hard problems. But everyone's looking for those. They're having in some ways grossly bid up. And if you're running an economical business and you want to bootstrap or you want to just be capital efficient, you need to look elsewhere. So there's a good financial reason in addition to just having really good ethical choices that are made. So I hope more of the listeners here kind of dial in there because I think that's a huge problem in recruiting and hiring, and I think there's huge opportunity in getting it right. But switching gears here a little bit, Vivienne, I know a lot of our audience are either early stage founders or would be founders, as well as some venture capitalists. And I think the problem or the question we keep hearing is, what segment of AI is investable? Where do we put our dollars? Where do we build businesses? The one clear bet that a lot of people make is hardware. So consumption of GPUs, NVIDIA, obviously huge company. I think the sixth largest by market cap now, $1 trillion business. And so there's scarcity in GPUs and there's a lot of investor appetite and interest in building that space. But beyond that, when you look at the broader infra space or the application layer, what are you seeing as opportunities that maybe are overlooked that founders or investors should consider more strongly?
Yeah. So obviously these giant models, foundation models, as they call them, are receiving funding at a scale that most investors can't really participate in. So Google just agreed to put $2 billion into Anthropic. Obviously, everyone wishes they could be a part of one of these rounds on some level, but you can imagine what kind of a percentage of the equity you might walk away with in a deal like that. And so what's exciting about them, of course, is, that someone like me for years and years has been able to do seemingly impossible things. Mm-hmm. Like I had an itch to scratch on gender wage gap. And so I built a bunch of web crawlers. They crawled through the websites of 60,000 companies, collected data, analyzed faces, read quarterly reports. 2 days later, all by myself, I had a new finding about gender wage gap. And, that would have been impossible 10 years before I did that. It would have taken years and armies of research assistants to do that work. Now I could do it, but I had to be able to build those models. Now, in theory, with GPT and all of the other LLMs, but also with the other kinds of generative models that are out there, and now they're incorporating, not that anyone lose their head and think just LLMs or just diffusion models, but reinforcement learning is now getting integrated into these systems. In fact, some of my causal work is in reinforcement learning. And there are other forms of AI to bring to bear here. So, these are exciting spaces, but what makes them exciting is it opens it up to be a tool that anybody could use.
Right.
Even if you didn't have a programming background, much less an AI background. And in that sense, there might even be some really everyday qualities that are open here and not as open to speculation, not as open to, well, I guess what I'm getting at is we can look at organizations now making almost meta-level projects, their own versions of foundation models to empower individuals without expertise to go do their own kind of dynamic work. So we used to think of a product needing to fill a specific need and a specific niche. A pencil allows me to write on a piece of paper, but now I can build product. Let's take, for example, one of my current companies, Dionysus Health. Mm-hmm. We have, through a lot of very fancy artificial intelligence, combined with epigenetics, we have the first ever biological test for postpartum depression. Period. Mm-hmm. No one's ever been able to. You get depressed after you have a baby, and you get diagnosed based on a questionnaire.
Yeah.
And that's the way it works. Now we can look at your epigenome and clearly see before you've ever become pregnant that you have a high risk factor for postpartum depression. It's not just in your head. It's real. It's biological. It's there. But along with our epigenetics, we built a natural language system that could analyze people's social media usage. And we could see evidence of how their moods were being yoked to their, in this particular case, to their menstrual cycle. So, and only in this population with an epigenetic predisposition. But interestingly, someone inside of our team threw together our own homebrew LLM. So we built it ourselves because we couldn't share patient data with Google or Microsoft. And we actually found that people just talking to the LLM without it pretending to be a doctor or anything, just their conversations, our model could actually see the patterns that predicted postpartum depression right there in their conversations. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is the idea that in our case, someone without a lot of expertise in AI was able to build a tool that can help diagnose something no one's ever been able to predictively diagnose before, just by throwing an LLM together in a non-specialized way. And that's kind of exciting to me. We're experimenting with a tool that analyzes kids' artwork to be able to identify from that artwork undiagnosed learning disabilities that we can then come and a lot of this work is through my philanthropic group, the Human Trust. So we're just building these things because we think they should exist in the world and make available. But it's amazing, with one homebrewed LLM, we're looking at kids generating artwork. We're looking at conversations with women who might be struggling with postpartum depression in the future, even though they're not pregnant right now. And we're also looking at it as a tool for people living on the street. So these are clearly philanthropic applications, but it just illustrates that there's a huge range of problems that one single example, one single instantiation of this new kind of AI, suddenly non-experts can bring to bear on a truly wide variety of problems. One last area, again, forgive me, this is public sector. We're looking at public sector policies that have causal relationships to reductions in homelessness. So we can really measure what works, but at scale in the real world, rather than having to run long-term research experiments. And again, a rich part of what we're doing is combining reinforcement models with large language models. None of this would have been possible before. You just can't answer the massive, messy scale of data that is homelessness until almost today. And I know I'm giving some targeted examples that are outside of private corporate investing, but I'm saying think of your problem space in the same way. Problems that feel a little bit impossible, where the data is messy and diffuse and all over the place. And instead of thinking of one single targeted technology solution that addresses one single targeted population, you can put together either an API-based system tied into, let's say, GPT-4, or if you need to, such as in my work, you can even build your own homebrew, jailbroken large language model, and you can solve a diffuse set of problems across the whole range of debates. So if I'm, building a company, and I'm building a couple right now, I'm not thinking what targeted tools. I'm thinking, how do I build one internal foundation model for my company, or buy the right one that then can be used by all of the cyborgs I'm employing to dynamically address emerging problems before I've locked them down. And I've even conceptualized this is an emerging problem, and 2 years from now, we're going to have a solution for it, because that's too long. Now our cycle is the moment even a non-technological employee understands a problem is emerging, they themselves can begin to bring technology to bear on it, rather than waiting for the engineers to get involved.
I think that's exactly right. I think there are new problems that can be solved, or there are age-old problems that can be solved now with this new technology that weren't solvable before. And I think that's a great area as a founder and as an investor to think through what are new possibilities given this inflection point. Well, Vivienne, it's been awesome having you on the show. Where can our listeners find more about what you're up to, the companies that you're working on? problems you're solving?
Well, I guess you can visit socos.org, SOCOS, which is my original philanthropic lab, and I also write a bit about my work there. But some big new passion areas. I mentioned the Human Trust. It is an independent, not-for-profit data trust. It holds data for all of my companies, and its sole fiduciary responsibility is the people who generated the data in the first place. And you can visit thehumantrust.org to learn more about what we're doing there. Dionysus Health, first test in the world for postpartum depression. And I'll throw in one last plug for optoceutics.com, which is the maker of this very fancy light behind me. We're in human trials for our tests on Alzheimer's, but we also are looking at areas like major depression and traumatic brain recovery. And for that matter, we actually find that people are just a little sharper when they use this very fancy light. So a whole bunch of really cool ideas for us all to be a little bit more cyborg.
Awesome. That's great, Vivienne. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. It's been a pleasure having you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.